Hello, I'm Mike Howell with the Oversight Project. We have a fascinating discussion lined up that hits really center mass for the underpinnings of a lot of the things the Oversight Project's been working on over the years. And we're joined by none other Dr. Pestritto, who is out with a terrific piece. I don't know whether to call it a book. It's too short for a book. It's too long for a pamphlet.
Right.
It is somewhere in between, but it is full of a great diagnosis of how we got to where we are as it relates to the growth of the administrative state that really puts into proper context the philosophical, historical, and political problems facing this Trump administration and how they're going about solving it. So it is a provocation is what the series of papers are called, and I love that because it's provoking, and the Oversight Project does a lot of provoking. So here to discuss his most recent provocation on the administrative state is Dr. Pestritto. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us, what's it all about?
Well, it's a piece that spans a pretty wide period in the history of the administrative state. You know, this is something that that didn't just land here. In the Biden or the Obama administrations. It's been kind of growing and metastasizing in America. Since at least the 1930s and maybe even before that. So. What the Claremont Institute had me do is they noticed that the Trump administration has really focused on trying to take on the bureaucracy and trying to bring the bureaucracy back under the control of the elected president. And so we've had a year now of a lot of activity, but it's not really understood very well. It's certainly not covered very sympathetically in the press, as you can imagine. So they asked me to spend some time kind of translating and explaining what the Trump administration was actually doing to try to rein in parts of the administrative state. And what I did in the provocation is basically I said, all right, let's set the scene first. So let's first talk about how we got into this mess. Let's go into some of the American history and the political thought and how this got birthed by the progressives back at the turn of the 20th century. Let's talk about how we got here, and then let's talk about the current efforts to try to fix it, to try to help get us out of this mess. And so the first part of it is a kind of historical account, and then the second part is a kind of understanding of the present, the current attempts to rein it in, and an assessment of how it's going so far.
Gotcha. Fascinating. It really explains what underpins all of the legal fights. It's whether President Trump can be in charge of the executive branch or not, whether he's president or not. And it's certainly the position in every court case, I think, that's like percolating is you can't do that, Mr. President. Somebody else is only allowed to. I want to go back to, the dawn of the progressive era, Wilsonian crafting this whole administrative state. Do you think, and this is, I think, an interesting question, the crafters of the administrative state, if they were to look at it now in 2025, it would be kind of as they designed it, seeing it implemented. It seems like it went from a technocratic class of experts, this like novel utopian ideal that they had, to now just this overbearing total state in a lot of areas deployed towards things like Somalian fraud and, whether you can deport people and just everlasting. What's your sense of how the project turned out for them?
Well, I think on the one hand, they would certainly not object to the extent of the administrative state's power. I mean, that would seem to me to be very consistent with the aims of the original kind of progressive fathers of the administrative state. I think what is sort of very different than what they envisioned, and you intimated it in your question, they really were kind of dreamy and utopian about the folks who would staff the administrative state. They were very taken with elite education, which was kind of new in America, in the latter part of the 19th century when they would have been educated. And they thought you're going to have these really educated people who they're not affected by the dirt of politics. They're pure. They're only going to see, the greater good. And if we could just get the politicians and to be honest, get the voters out of their way and leave them alone, to do what is objectively good. I don't think that anybody can seriously maintain that about today's administrative state. Everybody understands it's just a different kind of political institution. And increasingly, the left has come to understand that the the folks in the administrative state are their proxies. This is why they don't oversee them as much as they used to. It's why Congress doesn't, at least one party in Congress, doesn't assert itself as much over the bureaucrats as Congress used to. It's because they understand that the bureaucrats now are an extension of a single party, a single kind of left-leaning ideology.
Yeah, that's completely right. Have you seen Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure?
A very long time ago, and I have a bad memory. So
Okay, so basically they go back in time and take some historical figures like present day. Play along with me here. Say, we take President Wilson to 2026, take him to like a HUD field office out in, we'll say, Tulsa, and drop him in. He gets to see what the administrative looks like in state looks like in practice, which is a bunch of paperwork and GS7s, dull and sterile waiting rooms with long lines, and gets to deal with the government in that way. What do you think their reaction would be to like what it actually looks, feels, and is in practice in 2026?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Wilson, at least in his later years, was an idealist, obviously, and so, I think his model for what the American administrative state should look like was the Prussian administrative system under Bismarck. These progressives were all very heavily influenced by the Germans, by German philosophers, by the German state, which is a very impressive state in many ways in the 19th century. And so he really admired how efficient and how competent the Prussian bureaucracy was. And this was part of the problem because he said, well, there is kind of one difference between us and them. We're a republic and they're a monarchy. But he argued we can overcome that. That's not really an important difference because administration is neutral. You could basically plug and play in different kinds of regimes, and so that was his ideal. And obviously, the extent to which the contemporary administrative state, a typical government bureau, mirrors that, I think it's pretty far gone. Obviously, so. I think we're a long way from the progressive idealists.
Yeah, I do too. A couple of years back, we got a whole bunch of documents out of virtually every department and agency during the Biden years over what we call the transgender administrative state. And it was really shocking because they would devote to manuals, like 40-page government manuals with all the citations and the government speak as to exactly how to deal with what I'll call the recruitment and encouragement of the transgender craze inside the federal government. And it's just like that type of administration and government speak on an issue so absurd just shows it's like this is their tactic. It's the way they run their regime. It's completely out of control. But I want to shift for a second because the administrative state did not come to its apex of power, which we may be at today, without the help of the courts and Congress, the other branches that were supposed to play a strong role. Can you talk about? We'll start with the courts.
Yeah, you bet. A big part of the provocation that I wrote basically talks about the critical role of the courts as the enablers, as the legal enablers of the administrative state. So certainly it's birthed by Congress, right? Congress starts it by creating these agencies, by funding them, by delegating, by giving over its legislative power. But that has to be squared with the Constitution, and quite frankly, it's very difficult to square it with the Constitution. And so the courts have to play a kind of deceptive game with the administrative state, and that's what happens in the 1930s. And so the courts set some of the major precedents, sort of giving constitutional cover for the administrative state. And these are some of the precedents that are now lately very much back in the news in the first year of the Trump administration because the Trump administration is targeting some of these. It wants the Supreme Court especially to reconsider this kind of devil's bargain that it made with the administrative state, almost 100 years ago now. And so, I think that the folks in the new administration have been paying attention to the Supreme Court lately because over the last 10 or 20 years, there's been now a modest turnaround kind of cutting against the direction that the courts have taken for decades and decades and decades. And the court now, it's got some originalists on it, and it has given some signals, and there have been some decisions over the last decade or two that make it clear the court is starting to chip away at this older accommodation for the administrative state. And so now that you have the Trump administration in power, they've been watching that, and they want to strike on some of this stuff. And the biggest one being, of course, the president's removal of some top agency officials who were previously thought to be untouchable by the president, even though they're in the executive branch, and that's being litigated. And there was the Slaughter case about the removal of FTC commissioners. That now is the Trump administration has forced the issue, and they're basically asking the court, okay, you guys made an accommodation for this unconstitutional administrative state back in the 1930s. Would you like another shot at that? Would you like to look at that again? And it's why the left is absolutely screaming about this, because they understand what's at stake.
Yeah.
So that's what's going on right now.
Yeah, and I find it just almost comedic that, the American people in at least 2, if not 3, transformative elections elected the guy whose tagline is "You're fired." I mean, that's what President Trump is broadly known for on The Apprentice. And they don't want him to be able to fire people. And it's like, this was the deal. If we live in a quote-unquote democracy, which of course we don't, he gets to do the things that he told everyone he was going to do and he's allowed to do.
Well, if I may, it's interesting you use the word, hey, we live in a democracy, because, the critics on the left say, oh, this is, an assault on our democracy. Right. And so, no, actually, it's just the opposite of that. One of the best ways to think about, these complaints, the complaint is, well, this is really transferring power, to the president. And the question to ask about this is, I saw Randy Barnett put it this way. I thought it was a very, very good way of putting it. Okay, transferring it from whom, right? There's all this power out there. Well, who was exercising it before the president is now taking it back for himself? Well, it's people who are not elected. It's people who are not accountable. They're exercising vast authority over our lives, all facets of our lives, economic and otherwise. And what's going on in the Trump administration is the president is trying to take back for the voters, for the sovereign people, their power over the executive branch. And so, the only person that the people vote for in the executive branch is the president. Right. I mean, I know the vice president is on the ticket, but he's actually his powers are legislative. He doesn't have any formal executive powers. So it's only the president. And if you have people who exercise executive power in these agencies, but who don't have to answer to the president, then that executive power is being carried out in ways that are totally unaccountable, totally undemocratic. The voters elect the president. Why shouldn't he be able to control his subordinates in the executive branch?
Yeah, any exploration of this, new tagline of the left that it's an assault on democracy or fighting democracy, if you look at just second layer thinking on it, it just doesn't hold up, because every action that they're taking now against President Trump and his exercise of his democratically derived power is, contested on those grounds. I want to go back to the courts for a second.
Sure.
I'm glad you used the term chipping away, because, for my entire adult life, I've been told that if just Chevron went away, we'd be in nirvana. And I can't tell you how many lunches I've gone to. And you could tell if you look at me, I've been to a lot of lunches. But all of them told me, Chevron, if we just get rid of it, we will totally destroy the administrative state. And it doesn't seem like too much has changed since that case came down the right way, by the way. But now we got Humphrey's executor, and I don't think you'll take the position that solves everything, but can you just talk to us a little bit about the pieces and the Jenga blocks that are being taken out and what else needs to be done legally?
Yeah, first, I think you're right, and that there appears to be, as if we're kind of resetting now, if the courts are trying to tap the brakes and maybe even turn around on their accommodation for government by the unelected. This is sort of insulated fourth branch. Courts, by their nature, do things very incrementally, very slowly. They have to have cases. These cases have to percolate up through multiple levels. So the process itself is frustratingly slow, especially when many of us believe the situation is dire for the republic. You add to that the fact that the court under its present Chief Justice is famous for its incrementalism, so it. I think, especially when the lower parts of the federal court system are abusing their power so much, the fact that the Supreme Court is so slow to intervene is very problematic, and so that's I think one thing to be aware of with regard to overturning some of these major problematic precedents. You mentioned Chevron, which is a relatively recent one, basically 40 years old, a precedent where the court said essentially we're going to defer to the agency's understanding of vague law, and all these laws are vague. So it means essentially that the agencies were put in the place of getting to judge the extent of their own powers. That was the practical effect. And so, conservatives, originalists were quite correct to say, hey, we got to get rid of this thing. It's killing us. The reason why we haven't seen a ton of difference yet is because effectively the Supreme Court had sort of been ignoring Chevron for a number of years, basically pretending it didn't exist. And so all they really did was, in the Loper-Bright case, was to announce the death of something that really had died a long time ago. And with regard to Humphrey's executor, this is the case that allows Congress to carve out parts of the executive branch and say to the president, you don't get to control this, even though you're the only one who constitutionally is supposed to have executive power. That's the precedent that is teed up for being overturned, and I think it's pretty clear from the oral arguments in the Slaughter case it's going to be overturned. Again, this is something originalists have been aiming at for a long time. It's a case I've described as the second worst Supreme Court decision in the history of the United States, second only to Dred Scott. And so will immediately the administrative state go away? Of course not. That's not how these things work. But it is a precedent without which the administrative state could not exist. And so, what comes after that, I think you're going to have a lot more presidential control over administration. There are all kinds of forces of inertia, obviously, that will push back against that. It depends how bold President Trump's only going to be president for 3 more years. How bold is the next president going to be in using the removal power that will now be more robust if Humphrey's executor is overturned? We'll see. I think the other question that remains is, all right, Humphrey's executor is about kind of the top-level agency officials. Well, what about just the ordinary federal employee, the ordinary bureaucrat? Can a president come in and riff people, fire them? And say, well, I don't. Never mind the top agency official. We don't need these 1,000 people at this agency, or some mid-level person. Let's say, a lawyer at the Department of Justice who, they're not a top agency official, but they do influence policy. These people are all suing. Many of them have been removed. They're all suing. They're going through the merit protection system, and the courts are going to have to address that in the next year or two. It's a different kind of question. So we'll see how far they're going to take it.
Yeah, I'll add to your list FBI agents who have been weaponized and targeted the president and his supporters. They're all suing with, tons of free legal services and support behind them. And, a key mandate of this election was de-weaponizing those agencies, and it's being greeted with lawfare and being tied up in the courts. One last question on the judicial end of things. You brought up 2 terms I want to focus on that I think are kind of at odds with each other: incrementalism and originalism. And allow me to just explain briefly. I heard Justice Barrett speaking the other day about how she was basically pushing back on Patrick Deneen's, vision of common good conservatism and originalism. And she basically said that she's an originalist and never will take into account kind of the political concerns or issues related to the common good. I find that to be at odds with the recent history of originalism, where it seems to me, as you mentioned, they take an incrementalist approach to things, because to pull a Jenga block that would collapse the whole system, they don't want to do. They're cognizant of factors outside the Constitution, things that like how this will work out in practice. And so I guess that is my long and probably definitely not articulate way of saying, if you are an originalist, you only care about how the system, was designed to work and what happened originally. And it seems to me if you take the approach instead that we're going to do piece by piece to eventually get there, you're truly not an originalist. An originalist would not care about the ramifications to the system as it exists today, so long as it was getting back to that originalist intent. And so that's why I'm kind of short on the theory that this Supreme Court will get us where we need to go anytime soon. With its particular composition of the specific justices. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good point. Like you, I'm inferring sort of I'm more sympathetic to Justice Thomas's approach to these questions, which is, look, sure, I have to have fidelity to established precedents and the way that things have developed, but I take an oath to the Constitution. And my fidelity to the Constitution trumps, if you'll pardon the expression, trumps all of that. And so he, I think I'm been very happy to see him reminding his colleagues of that. That having been said, I think that conservatives in general make a mistake, and they've made this mistake, really quite a bit lately in looking to the courts as their ultimate savior. And this goes back to the Obama administration, right? When the Obama administration essentially was faced with a Tea Party Congress that would not implement its agenda, it started basically legislating through bureaucratic decree. And the Republicans in Congress had two options. They could have used their own Article I powers and said, no, we're going to fight you on this. We're not going to support this. You need the money that we appropriate. We're not going to give it to you. That would have been the direct case. But they would have had to have a public fight with Obama about that, and they were afraid to make the case, to the voters. And so what they did instead is they ran crying to the courts. And the courts consider individual cases. The courts are, at least when conservatives are in the courts, we are generally true to the way that courts operate. We deal with specific cases and controversies. This is a gradual thing. The legal process is not meant to radically and quickly change policy. Now, the left has used it that way for 100 years, but that's just generally not the way conservatives, when they get into the judiciary, operate. And so it's really the wrong instrument. Now, I love all the victories that we've had in the court. They're great. Any port in a storm, of course. And so I love to see Chevron taken down. I love to see Roe v. Wade overturned and Humphrey's executive. That will be important. But the question you asked me about that, well, how much is really going to change? I mean, you're right. Yes, that it's important, it's necessary, but that's not the major kind of political change that perhaps you and I are more interested in really getting the regime back on track. That has to come from the political branches. That has to come from going out and making a political case to the voters about what's going on. It's why I think the Trump administration is a very unique opportunity, because he's really the first president that I've seen in my lifetime who I think is capable of bringing about a kind of political momentum. And that has to come from an elected president, who connects with the people, who are sovereign. It can't be done. It can't be done through the courts. Ultimately, the courts can be obstacles. The courts can help a little bit here or there, but the main point is the political case. And so it's a unique opportunity. It's why the elections matter. The 26th election, the 28th election. This thing has to be sustained now over multiple elections. That's where the real battle is. It's not in the courtrooms.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. A strong, executive and vigorous and pursuing this thing, selling the agendas, how you get it done. Let's contrast that about President Trump, those undeniable facts, versus my favorite topic, the auto pen scandal. I mean, because we're basically talking about whether President Trump can be president or not. It's the left's position, and many in the courts, that he's not allowed to be president. Whereas in the Biden administration, Biden did not need to be president. the government was run by an unaccountable autopen with questions about whether Biden signed off on many of these things. He's admitted that he did not, in particular, as it related to a bunch of pardons. And I think we talk about that investigation quite a bit because obviously it's critically important who is running the country. But underneath that, I think the more important topic that hasn't been dissected enough is what that means about the administrative state. Mm-hmm. If you have in Trump like a vigorous executive who's clearly in charge, representative of the political and popular will of the country versus Biden, who was not in charge, what does that tell us about like our constitutional order and how it was functioning in those years?
Yeah, I mean, I've said one of the major problems with the administrative state, and one of the reasons why, excuse me, one of the reasons why I think things are finally starting to boil over is there's a clear sense among voters that elections come and go in this country, but they don't offer voters any actual ability to change the direction of the country, to change how they're governed. And I think people see that. And so, under a Biden administration, you've got an administrative state that is sort of sympathetic to the kind of progressive trajectory of the Biden administration. It doesn't really matter who the president is in that scenario. You can have a kind of, I don't know, a figurehead, I suppose is a generous way to describe his presidency. And the country is going to kind of go along on its sort of the trajectory it's been on for decades. As you say, the problem is with somebody like President Trump, who actually wants to govern. He thinks the voters have put him in office to change the direction of the country. And so he's running up against the sort of autopilot or the autopen, as you say. He's running up against kind of the autopilot trajectory of the administrative state, and that's why we're in this huge stinking fight right now. Because these are folks who are used to all the advantages of being in power, and you saw this in the first Trump administration, where quite frankly, I don't think the president and his people were prepared for the kind of resistance, right? He was too much of an outsider. Whereas this time around, they spent the interregnum really drawing lessons from the first administration, understanding a lot better what would need to be done in order to push back on the administrative state in effective ways. And that's what you've seen over the first year of the administration.
Yeah, let's put a little more meat on that bone because it's, the interregnum period was huge, and the lessons learned from the first administration, and then the quality and type of people that are in the second administration. What do you make of the efforts of DOJ, the way the Office of Management and Budget under Russ Vought are conducting their affairs? Just some meat on that bone, please.
Yeah, so I mean, DOJ got a lot of attention. That was sort of the headline initially of how the Trump administration was going to start to take on the administrative state. And the things that got the most attention were the spending. I mean, deservedly so. All the kind of outrageous examples that Musk and his people were able to uncover. But if you look at the original mission for DOJ, it actually was much more comprehensive than that. They really were aiming at pushing back on the power of the administrative state more broadly. So DOJ was a kind of, they repurposed some kind of defunct entity within the executive office of the president in order to get DOJ up and running really quick and to give it the power to kind of go into different federal agencies and expose a lot of the spending and all of that. But to my mind, it was never really going to be a terribly long-term thing because the real work of reforming the administrative state and of reining in the spending abuses, to the extent that the president can do that, it's through the ordinary organs of his executive office, through, as you mentioned, the OMB under Russ Vought, or OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, and it's those entities now that I think are very seriously bringing in the decision making in the bureaucracy back where it belongs, which is back under the control of the elected president, making sure that the agencies just aren't out there sort of on their own. And ironically, the origins of the executive office of the president, where OMB and all these guys are, actually back in the administration of Franklin Roosevelt.
Right.
Because Roosevelt's New Dealers, his New Deal zealots, helped create the administrative state and make it independent of the president. And then Roosevelt, for all the other problems that you could talk about with respect to him, but he sort of figured out, wait a minute, I've been elected by the people to do what they elected me to do, and now these people don't have to listen to me, and I'm losing control. And so that's what his Brownlow Commission, what's why it was created, to try to basically reassert presidential control over the administrative agencies that FDR's own people had created. And then so the executive office of the president right now is sort of the outgrowth of that original FDR effort to try to basically put the genie back in the bottle.
Right.
He let it out, and then all of a sudden he's like, oh, what did these people do that work for me? And too late. But the executive office has now been the way that the Trump administration has been most seriously trying to bring the agencies back in, and of course, from the point of view of the leftists and the agencies and their allies on Capitol Hill in both parties, I should add, this is like satanic. I think this is terrible. This is their territory. The appropriators, on the Hill. Well, wait a minute, we're the ones who have these relationships with the administrative agencies. We don't want the president actually controlling the executive branch, and that fight right now. It's why OMB is sort of in the crosshairs, not only of Democrats but of some Republicans on the Hill, is because they're actually trying to help the president exercise his lawful constitutional control over the executive branch, as the voters elected him to do.
Right, and as the name says, Office of Management and Budget. Mm-hmm. That's what it is there to do. Let's shift in focus to the last formal branch of government, which is, of course, is the legislature. There are more informal branches, with one of them probably being the administrative state. Let's talk about Congress's role and how we got here over the long march of the progressive movement. Fixating first on the lack of oversight. Obviously, I'm with the Oversight Project. We started it because we don't think there is enough oversight. And Congress has systemically lost their ability through a variety of reasons. One, they can't get any accountability on this stuff. When they sue, they fail, and they don't have the political will often to sue, although the Democrats will, I assure you, if they win the midterms. They will be in court by virtue of some of their congressional actions every other day, and impeachments, of course. Congress is not capable of overseeing this huge morass of the administrative state, both in a quantitative sense. It's just too big. Mm-hmm. Congress, used to have more staff. And, Gingrich famously cut the staff quite a bit. They don't have the expertise, although we hate that word when we're talking about the administrative state. And they don't have the political will. A lot of them, have their little fiefdoms and committees and appropriations vehicles and earmarks that they need to keep alive, and it becomes a tragedy of the commons there. What's your sense of Congress's failure over the last century and the contribution to the growth of the administrative state?
Yeah, this is the hard part of the equation, because I think, as important as it is, and as much progress can be made with a president who's energetic about this, ultimately Congress has to be involved. Mm-hmm. And Congress created this. I mean, in a way, this is sort of the good news, right? There's nothing constitutionally etched in stone about the administrative state. Congress created it, and it could uncreate it. It through the ordinary legislative process. I don't think any sane person could predict that they would be willing to do that, which is the reason for my skepticism. But Congress gave us the administrative state. I would really kind of divide it into two basic ways of thinking about it. You say that Congress doesn't sufficiently have oversight over the agencies. That's absolutely true. The problem is that Congress got itself into the situation of needing to have oversight, yes. Right? So originally, and this was a great progressive complaint, Woodrow Wilson famously, said of Congress, it spends too much time legislating. It needs to give that up and worry instead just about overseeing the legislative power that it should give to the bureaucracy. And so ideally, Congress wouldn't have much of an oversight function because we wouldn't have an administrative state that needs to be overseen.
Well said.
Okay. Now we're well past that point, right? But so they have now created this. They have now given away this power. And so absolutely it needs to be held to account, and that has to be done through vigorous oversight. And it used to be that Congress, even members of both parties, would sort of circle the wagons and defend the institutional prerogatives of Congress against bureaucrats if the bureaucrats weren't being properly respectful to their wishes. Nowadays, however, that's all gone because ideology has come in and trumped any institutional self-interest. And so instead of, if you have a rogue agency or a rogue administrator that's disregarding Congress, instead of members of both parties sort of in their joint self-interest engaging in oversight and holding the bureaucracy accountable, now the Democrats in Congress, they understand that the agencies are their ideological proxies. They're going to do the progressive legislating and governing that the left in the Congress can't do. And so they are not going to join in any effort, if there were any interest on the Republican side, in sort of genuinely overseeing and holding the bureaucrats to account. One of the greatest examples of this came, you may recall, when there were hearings about the IRS abuses. And so you had Lois Lerner and her ilk, hauled up on Capitol Hill. And normally, this would be an intimidating thing for a bureaucrat. These are people who control your budgets, regardless of party. You need to at least show deference and kiss the ring and all that kind of stuff. Lois Lerner, Koskinen, these guys basically told Congress to get lost. They stood up there and said, you don't matter. We don't really care that you're mad at us, because they knew that the Democrats would have their back. They knew that the Democrats would never join Republicans in holding them to account, even for the most obvious abuses, because the interest of the left on the Hill right now is not in protecting the institutional integrity of Congress. It's in sort of ideological progressivism, and they know they're going to get that in the administrative state. And so that's what's changed, and that's why oversight has gone away.
Yep, for that reason, and unfortunately a million others. It's a performative exercise.
It is.
The political, we call it the incentive loop. You get to yell and you get to sit in the higher chair. The witnesses sit in the lower chair, and you can interrupt them. And so members like it. It makes for better clips, and that's what it's unfortunately devolved to. It's just a circus. It's sad. We're trying to save it.
It's a sad sideshow. I mean, when you see these cabinet people hauled up, I mean, it's painful to watch. The committee members are all trying to get their snippets for media. The witness now knows that game, and so the witness is trying to do that as well. It's a total show. It's a total waste of time. They could shut the whole thing down, and the country would be better for it.
Well, that's why we started an oversight project. We saw an opening there. We've covered a lot of ground. 3 branches, over 100 years of history. In conclusion, what we miss? How would you sum it up?
Well, I think that I have a tendency to depress people because I talk about how this terrible mess that we've gotten ourselves into and how entrenched it's become. I do think to try to end on a note of optimism, this is an opportunity that we have right now that I actually never thought I would see in my lifetime. I've heard a lot of good Republican presidents in a way, pay lots of lip service to reining this in, but absolutely nothing get done. Really the only attempt since the 1930s to do something about this was actually in the Nixon administration. That was a pretty modest attempt. You see where even that tepid effort, what that led to. So, I never thought I would see this opportunity, and I'm not saying it's a great opportunity. I'm not saying, hey, this is really going to happen, but at least it's an opportunity. I never thought it would happen until the country suffered some massive calamity, economic or otherwise. But yet here we are. And I think that the administration is trying to re-energize the executive, reconstitutionalize it. to make it more democratic. It's not an assault on democracy. It's actually a restoration of democracy. And so let's seize that opportunity. Let's understand the opportunity. Yes, there are many reasons for people to be skeptical, but we take advantage of the opportunities we're given and do our best.
There's nothing pessimistic in that. And in fact, I think quite the opposite. There's no black pill in there. White pills are the only pills we take, maybe a multivitamin or two. But for the first time, it feels like in my much shorter political life, the common sense Americans now understand how things went off the rails. And we're talking about it frequently. And I think it'll come to define the future political battles. And there's a lot to be said for knowing how we got so off the rails. And it'll help inform us get back on the rails. And that was never true before President Trump and those who have come with him into the administration came on the political scene. So I am internally optimistic about that. Dr. Pestritto, thanks for joining us. We will link his provoking provocation here in the comments and below. Check it out. It's fascinating stuff. Thank you.
Thank you.